My name is Mohsen Musavi, co-founder, CCO, and COO of Blinkmoon.
Hi, my name is Hugh Bursey. I'm the founder and CEO of Blinkmoon.
So you guys have founded a new gaming studio, but before that, can you give us a little elevator pitch about what you used to do with your old studio?
Sure. So I actually met Mohsen at a visual effects studio here in Vancouver, Canada, called Scanline. I was working with him on Game of Thrones, which I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit about. He was actually my boss at Scanline. So I'm happy to kind of be now working and collaborating with my previous boss. And so we actually ended up working on that show for close to a year, but I was there in 4 years. Mohsen was there for 10 years.
Yeah, for sure. So I have been in the visual effects industry for the past almost 20 years, and I have worked at a number of sort of high-end visual effects studios, including Scanline, which is now acquired by Netflix, sort of the lead visual effects vendor for all Netflix moving forward. I have an engineering background, but for the past 12, 13 years, I have been a visual effects supervisor, which is sort of drives the entire project. And I have worked on a number of big projects, including I was the lead visual effects supervisor on final season of Game of Thrones. We worked directly with HBO and we got an Emmy for it back in 2019. And I have worked with, I've had a lot of collaboration with director Roland Emmerich. I've worked on 2012, I've worked on Independence Day. I've consulted on the Moonfall that was in the cinemas this year. I have worked on a number of Warner films, including The Meg. We were the lead vendor and the lead visual effects supervisor on The Meg, as well as a number of the DC projects. Same thing on the Marvel side, same thing on the Disney side. So that has been my life for the past 20 years. Somewhere along the line, we find a way of getting out of that and joining into the gaming space.
Now, just because I'm interested, what did you particularly do at the visual effects house? Because I mean, there are some houses that are dedicated just to wire removal, just to background removal. What was your role?
Yeah, so on the visual effects, and Scanline is one of the leading visual effects companies in the world. We have done some of the biggest blockbusters in the last 10 years. And give an example, with Game of Thrones, we were the main visual effects vendor, as I said, the lead visual effects vendor, working on the final 3 episodes, episode 4, 5, and 6. So you do the entire process. We are there from the day one, working with HBO and the directors and the designing King's Landing and designing the entire new technology and methodology of how to approach, something like Game of Thrones. So you're involved in the visual effects as a visual effects supervisor. You're involved on many different levels. You're involved on client relations. So you basically discuss with the studio and the vendors and the directors how to approach from a logistical point of view. That's one, but that's a small part. And then you're involved in the entire budgeting process. You're involved in the entire art direction and the entire design of every bits and piece that you see on the screen. And then, at least with my background, coming from an engineering background, I'm also big time involved in the technology of how to approach that. So you have a team, my team on Game of Thrones was about 450 artists across the globe. We had people in Germany, we had people in States, we had people in all the vendors and all of the different offices of the Scanline. So you sort of drive that entire process. You could have a creative hat for 2 hours, and then a technology hat for 3 hours, and then a budget hat for 2 hours. You sort of constantly go back and forth, and you're the face of the project when it comes to working with the HBO and the talent and the directors directly. And you go through the whole process. We worked on Game of Thrones for about 15 months. That's one project. When we did the Meg, for example, you go on set. I was on set in New Zealand for about 7 months, and you shoot the movie on set with the principal cast and the director, and you are the person advising everyone on how to shoot the movie, so that you can later go and add the visual effects on top. And then once you're done with the shoot, you go back into the company and you spend another 10 months of building the visual effects, again wearing those 3-4 different hats at any given point. to get the work done. So we were not doing wire removal, that's part of the work, but we were doing some of the most complex and advanced visual effects that was done in the last 10 years.
So you were basically start to finish, like everything, model creation, textures, lighting, particles, everything. Okay.
Everything, yeah.
Hugh, going to you, how do you think your skills as a visual effects artist will help you in moving to this new adventure of game development and game design?
Yeah, actually, I got sort of the very fledgling portion of my understanding of 3D in games. There was a game called Second Life, and I was playing that when I was very young. And you could choose to be a content creator, or you could choose to be just a player. And I naturally chose to be a content creator. I love creating things. So I got into Maya and all sorts of different 3D packages and programs at that young age. And I started my own online businesses in Second Life. I was selling goods, and I had a couple of magazines in the game that I was working with. It was a very fun experience, and so it kind of led me to understand what it was like to grow a community of thousands of members and deliver content to them. And so having done that, it's sort of something that I've done in the past in a very small way. And I actually, with my investors, this is something fun that I do bring up to them. And I always find that people are more amused by that experience than they are by my how I've progressed through the visual effects industry. So I've actually held leadership roles in the look development, or look dev department. And so that's really my focus, and that's what my focus has been in visual effects particularly. Working with tools like Houdini and Maya, all this kind of stuff. It's been a very it's been an evolving thing, because visual effects is always evolving, and if you don't evolve with it, then you kind of get left behind. But I believe that's, to answer your question, that's one of the key factors that we love about visual effects, is we're always trying to use new tools, and how do we do this with huge amounts of data and huge amounts of information that we need to put into these scenes. So working with Mohsen, I actually got to learn from him a lot of those techniques on how do we do an environment like King's Landing, which has thousands of buildings and so much going on. How do you actually put that together? So working with people in those teams and working on creatures that are super complex and bringing that experience into games is something that I'm really excited about. Working with Unreal Engine, Mohsen can maybe touch on that a little bit, but working in Unreal Engine, especially Unreal Engine 5, there's a huge crossover now with games and the film or visual effects industry sort of coming together. Virtual production, there's tons of this happening. You might have seen it all over the place, but we have that experience on the visual effects side. And we've also brought in one of our co-founders is Troy Dunniway from the games industry, and he's had 25 plus years, has released a bunch of games, worked on a bunch of games, Command and Conquer, Age of Empires 3, Ratchet Clank. He's held executive positions at Ubisoft, Microsoft. You can kind of go look him up, and he's an incredible individual for us to kind of merge these two sort of pools of thought, essentially.
So Mohsen, to you, how does this gonna differentiate from your business practices as a visual effects studio? Because I used to work in post-production about 10 years ago. Things may have changed, but back then it was a list of shots that you'd look at, and you'd have to judge how long it would take and do a bid and say, for these 50 shots, we would charge X amount of dollars. Is it still the same way? And what challenges will there be moving into the game space for you from a business side?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, on the post-process space, especially in my job, a lot of it goes into planning a plan that can fit into the budget. Again, go back to the Game of Thrones. We did the impossible with a budget that is a TV budget, and you still aim at a quality that you would only expect from a sort of a feature film blockbuster, right? So you have to rewrite the rules. That's what I always constantly say. You have to rewrite the rules to be able to do that sort of things. So in the gaming space, it's very similar. A lot of the content creation, as you mentioned today, when it comes to content creation for games, the process is almost identical, almost identical when you go into creating environments, assets, cinematics, trailers. and so on and so on. And I think with the Unreal Engine 4 or 5, especially 5, right, the line is so blurred in between in terms of what you can do. The visual effects industry is now using the gaming tools to achieve what wasn't achievable 3 years ago, right? It's really, really interesting. So it makes it a bit easier for us to do the transition, you know? So when we come into the gaming space, especially on the content creation, my daily work is very similar to what I've been doing for the past 20 years, you know? When it comes to work on the concepts, on the posters, on the trailers, on the contents, right? Now the merge with the engineering of the gaming, right? That is the challenge, and that is a sort of new space for us. But as I mentioned earlier, I do come from an engineering background, and we have done a lot of engineering and visual effects as well. You know, visual effects, content creation, but you could have very complex solvers, tool sets that allow you to produce the content that you're working on. Let it be procedural environments that these days seems to be a hot topic when it comes to video games. Let it be sort of photoreal creatures that have simulated muscle structure in them. You know, with it for mech, that these days is also a hot topic on the video game. For example, when we did mech, we worked with a studio called Ziva Dynamics. You may know them. They are now acquired by Unity. And we were the first studio to actually use the technology to build the mech. We were the first studio to enable them to actually use the technology in a major blockbuster. And now that technology is being sort of explored big time to be a real-time sort of muscle dynamic simulation in the video game space. So really the line is blurred, and that's where the exciting part is. I think 10 years ago, I wanted to start doing video game. It would feel very foreign to me. But since the line is really, really blurred these days, you know, it has been a much easier transition, if that makes sense, right?
Since you are moving to the games industry in part, can you talk about a little how Hollywood, specifically AAA Hollywood, I know when they did Deadpool, they hired a video game CGI trailer house to do all the visual effects because they did it for a fraction of the price. But I do know that sometimes Hollywood will look at something, whether it's a popular TV show or a AAA film, and if you're doing it too cheap, they'll just say no because they're afraid that it's too low costing. Can you talk a little bit about that business practice and how you think it'll help you in the gaming space where you have the budget up front and like you don't have to pitch, you know, how much these 5 shots will do? It's an entire game from start to finish.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned on the visual effects space, right? The budgets are limited. And every day, every studio wants to get more for less. That is the usual practice, right? And that's really the challenge in the visual effects side. When I get involved in a project, right, the conversation is all around what technology can be used moving forward that can make the work easier and faster, right? So these days, when you work on visual effects, that's the interesting part, is that something to look absolutely photoreal and good, it's a given. There's not a discussion anymore that if something has to look good or not, right? The money doesn't really define that. It's mainly about the volume of the work. It's more about, do I do 10 shots or 1,000 shots? But the quality, the bar has, rise so high that, you don't go to a studio working on a TV series or a TV show and then say, well, the quality doesn't really matter. If you look at Game of Thrones, if you look at Lost in the Space, if you look at a lot of the recent sort of blockbuster TV series, if that makes sense, right? The quality is up there with a lot of the feature films, right? But the budgets are very, very limited. So that's where the gaming sort of come in play. Where in the gaming space you have bigger budget, right? Because you're dealing not only with the content creation, but you're also dealing with the entire engineering side of things, right? And the beauty of it is that in the gaming side, the engineering is seen as something you have to do additional to the content creation, meaning that you do have budgets to actually create the game, work on the engineering side, work on the technology. On the visual effects space, the budget that you're dealing with is really mainly content creation. So when it comes to introducing a new technology, right, this is the difficult part, because that usually in today's world, it's not part of the budget. So if you need to create a new technology for King's Landing, you need to create a new technology for the mech, it is hard to fit that back into the budget, if that makes sense, right? On the gaming side, you have the content creation budget. Additionally, you have your 70%. of your budget to actually build the engineering and build the tool sets and do all of that. So I think in a lot of forms, it is very similar to the visual effects, but at the same time different. And I think that is the exciting part, that we can have a roadmap that is, let's say, 2 to 3 years, right? With clear milestones in mind and be able to target that, versus on the visual effects space where, yes, the post-production, or the project itself might be a 2.5 years project, but the post-production, these days, they're usually 12, 13 months, most of the time, they're only 6 to 7 months. You really get the work and you have to deliver in 6 to 7 months, which makes it very tricky to engineer something from scratch, if that makes sense. So on the gaming side, you have more time, you have more milestones to be able to really build up the technology before you get to use it in the context of the game, right?
Speaking to that technology, I know The Mandalorian has executed some brand new tech with specifically Unreal Engine and brand new cameras that sync up to screens that are projecting a real image. And you can have multiple cameras and you can change the camera and the camera will know to change the scene in the background and reflect where the position is. How does that technology translate to games? Is it easy to, like, if it's in Unreal, can you just drop it in if it's already rigged, animated, and lit, or do you have to kind of do a little tweaking? Talk a little about that process.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the visual effects, on the traditional visual effects, if you wanted to work on a beautiful cinematic, right, it's a long process before you can see the content. Sometimes we're talking about 6 to 7 month process that you have to work on your assets, you work on your layout, you work on your previs. You spend a lot of time doing the groundwork before you can put it into the context. And usually what happens by the time you're that far, you have to spend your 7 months and you have your camera already designed months ago. Now you're looking at it, you may not like it, right? It's very hard to change. It's very hard to go all the way back and tweak something. I still remember on Lord of the Rings, on the last one, in the making of, they were saying is that, in the last minute, 2 days before they were locking the shots, Peter Jackson wanted to change the camera on one of the shots, one of the big elephant shots fighting together. I still remember that. And it was a big dilemma back in the days to change that a week before the delivery, right? Still is in the visual effects space, right? So why something like Mandalorian and the virtual production space is exciting is that you get to play around with a lot more much sooner, right? So just from a creative standpoint and being able to elevate the quality of the work as a filmmaker, it makes it much easier for me as a director to go in and say, I can see the world around me and I can take a camera, right, that is tracked in real time, and I can basically figure out my angle with the right lighting day one on the set, instead of doing an animating a previs, doing a little scribble, and then hope for the best in 6-7 months, right? So I think that is from a filmmaker standpoint, I think that is what get them excited for the most part, to be able to be in the loop much earlier. And then the other part of it is the entire lighting standpoint, right? That you can now light your environment, you can light your cast, you can light your set exactly using the right lighting, the right luminance, the right color palette that is going to end up in the film, right? We used to do, as you know, the whole blue screen and green screen. It's such a challenge. It's underrated how difficult that is to shoot on blue screen and make it look photoreal later. It's really, I would say, it's one of the hardest thing I've done, in the past 20 years to actually make that work, right? And when you put that on the screen with your LEDs, it's a whole different level of integration that is right there from the get-go. So in the video game side, the interesting part is that with Unreal Engine 5, same thing there. Let's say some years ago on the video game side, if you wanted to work in a cinematic in the game, you would somehow go through the same process. You would have a low-end cinematic, no shaders, no texture, no lighting, because you had to work on it to get it to the certain stage. Your engine itself wasn't ready at a time when you were working on the content, and towards the end, you would have an engine ready, you would have your lighting ready, and then it would all come together, right? Real time, but you would still go through the same process. Today in Unreal Engine 5 or 4, not only you can start getting into the content right away, but also you can use now, here's interesting, you can use some of the techniques that we're using in virtual production on the gaming side. I can now take an iPad and design my camera in real time in Unreal Engine 5 as I'm working on the game. If it's a cinematic, I don't have to have usual, camera animation done in Maya and put into Unreal Engine 5. I can take my camera in my hand, as an artist, as a director, as an art director, right? And design that cinematic using some of the techniques that we're using in film production, with virtual production, right? So the line is getting blurred. We're using Unreal Engine in the film industry, and we're using the techniques of virtual production into the gaming to sort of make the process of content creation easier. So, and that's what gets me excited, right?